Worship in every season. My journey through loss. Loss is a huge topic to speak on, but I think it is a topic that affects us all. We have all experienced loss of some kind in our lives. Loss of childhood, loss of dreams that never came true, loss of a home or of friends. Maybe you've already lost your parents, or you've lost a child. I don't know where you are on your journey of life and how big a role loss plays for you right now, but I am convinced that this topic is something that everyone can relate to in some way. I was quite overwhelmed to be asked to speak on this, Karen. I have never shared my journey of loss in a public setting, and I'm not here to give any steps of what to do, how to grieve or heal after loss. I don't think any two stories are the same, and everyone needs to find their own way through this journey. But the main point I want to bring across today is that God is there. God is with us, and He will walk with you and will bring healing in His time. He knows our individualities, He knows what speaks to us, encourages or comforts us, and He will walk a different journey with each one of us. But what is the same in each of our journeys is that God will be there, and we will get to see His faithfulness in due time. So, this talk is called Worship in Every Season because I didn't want to start right away with my loss and the trauma of my life, but give you a bit of insight into my life from when I was young and what God did in my heart before I got to the hard loss in my life. Because it's quite beautiful to see how God prepares us for something without us even knowing it. Some of you may know that I grew up in Africa. I was born to German parents in Germany, but moved to South Africa when I was barely 1 year old. We lived there for 9 years and then moved here to Nairobi when I was just 10. So I did all of my middle and high school here in Nairobi until I graduated in 2000. I had a very happy and easy childhood. I knew I was loved and cared for by my parents, and growing up in a home of missionary parents, I learned a lot about the Bible and about God's love for me. Singing was always a big part of my life because everyone in our family sings beautifully, and my dad often pulled out his guitar and we would sing together at home, not just at Christmas or Easter, but all year round. And we also learned to sing in front of people a lot on our home assignments. For those of you who know, missionaries go to their home country and speak in their churches. So my parents would share about the ministry, and then they would call us all up, and we would line up in front and do the pretty songs like a good missionary family. Most of the time, I think I just enjoyed our singing for the sake of the music and the melodies, and because it was fun to sing together. But there were some songs that really touched my heart. I remember a few particular songs where I felt God stirring something in me, and I would feel a great gratitude to God and a joy of life because of the words of a song. But when I became a teenager, something happened that turned out to be very significant for me and my relationship with God. I was asked to join the worship team at Nairobi Chapel. Back then, we met at Mamlaka Hill, and we're a much smaller church, but it was still quite daunting to be the only teenager and the only Mzungu on the whole team. The worship leader at that point took me under her wings and taught me so much about worship, not just singing, but worship being a lifestyle. I sang out of gratitude to God for all the good things He had showered on my life, praising Him for His power and care. My first big encounter with loss was when I finished school and had to move to Germany for studies. I know that probably sounds strange to many to say it that way, because going abroad to study is a great opportunity and blessing. But for me, it meant losing everything I knew and called home. I had never lived in Germany for a long time. I loved Kenya. I had many friends and didn't know how to fit into German culture. I really struggled for a long time with the thought of leaving Kenya, my parents, and the culture I felt at home in, and it was a huge loss to me. I went through a grieving process of saying goodbye, and for the first while in Germany, my personality was quite different. I was so unsure about things around me that I hid behind my big brother, and I spent a lot of time alone. I remember my first semester at university. It was winter, and I was really struggling with a cold. And I didn't know how to approach people at the university. So in the breaks, I would look for a bench outside that had some sun shining on it. And I would go sit on the bench, I would close my eyes and enjoy the sun and the warmth. And then I would read my Bible till the next class, so I didn't have to talk to anybody. I am naturally a people person and quite outgoing, but in this season of feeling insecure and not knowing who I am in a new place, my personality changed a bit. I think that is often something that happens in seasons of loss and grieving. Because of the thing or person we have lost, we have a hole inside of us that makes us wobbly within ourselves. It's almost like we have to regroup to find inner stability again, and that can take some time. So if that's maybe where you are at the moment, I want to encourage you to give yourself time. To be patient with yourself and not get too worried about being different from your normal self. You haven't lost yourself. There's just a hole that is causing an imbalance, and you need time to find a new balance in your new life. But it will come. This season changed for me once I'd been in Germany for a while, and we found a really good church to join. It was a small church plant, and it was easy to get to know people, and I made good friends there. Very soon after joining, I was invited to be part of the worship team, and after a year, a friend of mine and I were asked to lead the worship ministry at church. It was a really special season in my life, where I learned so much about leadership, friendships, and about God speaking to us in worship times. We had services on Wednesday evenings, where we sang and prayed and listened to what God was saying in a very non-conservative, open kind of manner. And through that time, musical worship became a two-way conversation for me. And it wasn't just a way to say thank you to God for his goodness. I led the worship team there for almost 3 years, until something very complicated happened, which actually caused some disciplinary action to be taken by the church leadership. And I had to step down from all my involvement in church ministry. This was a huge blow to my faith. I was involved in church on so many levels, helping with the street evangelism on Friday evenings, being part of event planning groups, and then my big responsibility, leading the worship team. And now I was suddenly told to just sit in the pews. It was a major loss to me to lose this calling that I had of how to serve God. But even bigger than that was the loss of my picture of God that I had made for myself. I had put God in a box, convinced that I knew how he would act, how he would protect and guide me, and that if I followed him, he would never let me get into a situation like this. But he did. And I had been praying the whole time. How could he have just let me run into a wall and fall flat on my face? I didn't know how to trust God anymore, if apparently he didn't always protect me from making dumb mistakes. I didn't know how to follow Jesus if I could get so lost, even though I thought I was listening to him. For the first time in my life, I was overwhelmed by my own sinfulness and confronted with the reality that I did not have all the answers, that I couldn't explain God or his ways, and that there is an aspect of mystery in our faith in God. I went to a Christian house for retreat and healing to process some of what had happened. And as I was crying about losing my way of worshiping God through song, the lady asked me a very eye-opening question. Do you think your value before God comes from what you do? What if you had an accident, if your voice was taken away and you were bound to a wheelchair the rest of your life? Do you think you would be less useful and valuable to God? And do you think you couldn't worship him anymore? To me, that was a very deep question. And I would like to give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about it yourself. So I realized from thinking about this that God loved me and valued me just for being, not for doing. And I realized that I don't have to be able to sing to worship Him, but that my whole life is worship. Not even just the acts of worship, but even just setting my mind on Christ. Just being who He made me is worshiping Him and bringing Him glory. At the same time, I read the book, The Purpose-Driven Life, and although I don't remember much of the book, I remember the introduction very well. It spoke of us being on a journey with Christ, and all my life, I had imagined this journey to be very goal-focused. Jesus and I were going somewhere together to make a difference, to be a blessing, to build His kingdom. But through this book, I understood that the goal of our journey with Christ is not actually reaching somewhere, but it is walking together. The journey has different seasons. Sometimes walking along a beautiful field with tree-shaded paths when things are going well. Sometimes climbing up steep mountains. Sometimes just sitting beside a creek, letting our feet dangle in the water. Sometimes taking a nap in the lush green grass because we need a break. Sometimes panting through a dusty, dry desert. The point is that we're going together, that I walk with Him, enjoy His company, listen to and learn from Him, and the more time I spend with Him, the more I'll become like Him. There is no singular geographic or social goal we need to reach. The purpose of our Christian lives is to be with Him, walking, resting, struggling, but together. And I'd like to give you just a minute for a personal reflection. Just think about your own relationship with Jesus, your own relationship with God. Is it goal-focused or fellowship-focused? Maybe God is saying something to you today. Just take a few minutes to listen and write down what you hear Him say in your heart. After this difficult lesson, I had a year of counseling with a lovely lady from our church, and God tore down a lot of false pictures that I had painted for myself. He also showed me that He is a trustworthy God. And after a while of sitting in the pews at church, I was invited to come back into leadership and help in the worship team again. God brought a lot of healing and a lot of deep joy and trust in His faithfulness, knowing that things aren't always going to be easy, but that He would be there through it all. Soon after that, I met Daniel, my husband, for those of you who don't know me. And 3 years later, we got married and moved back to Kenya in 2008. I was super happy to be back here and was looking for ways to use my training that I had gotten in Germany as a special ed teacher for blind and visually impaired children. That was what I had studied for almost 7 years in Germany, and I really enjoyed it. I volunteered at a school here for a while, and after a year of being here, I got pregnant. And this is where my real story of learning to live with loss started. And to be honest, it hasn't stopped since, because it's something that I will carry as a hole in my heart all my life. Our oldest daughter, Samara, was born on March 18th, 2010. During my pregnancy with her, the doctors noticed her delayed growth, starting from week 20. They did different tests, and I went for scans every few weeks to make sure my baby was still growing. And nobody could really find out the problem, why she wasn't growing at the speed expected. Everything else seemed fine, though, and so the doctor said as long as her head is growing at the same speed as the rest of her body, she's doing fine. I got all the way to week 35 of my pregnancy before her head started growing faster than the rest of her body. As soon as the doctor saw those measurements, she organized for a cesarean, and a day later, I was in theater to have our baby. We were very nervous, but at this point, the gyna and pediatrician were still saying that everything looked fine, and she would just have to stay in hospital until she grew till 2 kilos before we could take her home. Even before she was born, God already gave us a promise over her life by giving us a name. We didn't know if she'd be a boy or a girl, and we'd already chosen a boy's name, but we weren't so sure about the girl's name. One day, as I was on bed rest and worrying about my unborn baby, I suddenly remembered this name, Samara, that I'd heard 2 years before, mentioned by a friend. I remembered that it sounded pretty and that it had a really cool meaning, but I couldn't remember the meaning. So I wrote to my friend and asked her, what does Samara mean again? And she wrote back and said, it means protected by God. And I knew immediately that this was going to be our daughter's name and that it was his promise that God would be looking after her despite her difficult start. But we had no clue how difficult her start would be. Our little girl was born a lot smaller than expected at 1.2 kilos. She was rushed off into an incubator, and over the next few days, we kept finding out more and more about the reason why. First, they discovered a triple heart defect. Next, they discovered she was born with rubella. I must have gotten rubella during my pregnancy without knowing it. I didn't notice it because I was vaccinated against it, and as we found out later, the vaccinations only help 70%, so you can still get it. Babies infected with rubella in utero can have one or all three of three major disabilities: heart defects, blindness through cataracts, and an inner ear deafness, which cannot be treated. Samara had all three. But you can't know that right at birth. The eyes first have to develop enough for you to recognize the cataract, and the hearing needs to be checked through special tests of brain activity. So those were things that we could not do here, and all doctors suggested we better take her to Germany to get her checked out well. After spending 7 weeks in hospital, we finally got to take Samara home when she reached 2.2 kilos. She was still tiny, but it was wonderful to have her home, even though we knew by now that she couldn't see. But there was hope for surgery later, which would give her eyes and brain a chance to develop her sight. The joy of being home only lasted 2 weeks, when we were suddenly told by doctors in Germany that she needed to have this cataract removal surgery done within the first 3 months of her life. Otherwise, her brain would never learn to see normally. So, within 3 days, we got Samara a passport, we booked tickets, we packed up our house, and we flew to Germany, thinking we would be gone for 2 to 3 months to have the eye surgery done and get her checkups done. That trip to Germany ended up taking us 15 months, and Samara having 9 surgeries, including a very invasive open heart surgery and getting a cochlear implant, which gets inserted into the inner ear so that she can get some hearing. It is very hard to summarize the first year of Samara's life. So many things happened, and so many emotions went on inside of us. It was an absolute roller coaster, but I will try to give you a bit of a picture. We got to Germany, had an appointment with the eye specialist the next morning, only to be told that she was too small to perform such a big surgery, especially with the heart defect she had. She was still just over 2 kilos. They said since she was born 5 weeks early, we could wait those extra 5 weeks and try to fatten her up until then. Big disappointment for us. Why had we rushed here in 3 days, and now we had to sit around for 5 weeks? Next, we did her checkups. Going to the ear department, we were confident that those tests would be good because we had seen Samara react to us when we came into the room and made noises. But the shocking news was given that she was completely deaf on one ear and almost deaf on the other ear. To me, that was a huge blow. How could that be? We had sung to her. We had calmed her from crying. We had seen her react to things, but apparently those were just her other senses that responded. I had accepted the fact that my little girl would be visually impaired. After the surgery, she would hopefully see enough to get by, and I could help her with that. I had studied how to help kids with visual impairment. I knew that there were options and opportunities out there for her. But most of these options are based on using her hearing. Now my girl had no hearing either. She couldn't use her hearing to compensate for her loss of vision. She was going to be blind and deaf. How would I interact with my child? She would never hear me even talk to her. The doctors talked about trying out hearing aids to see if they could make a difference. But after some time, we all realized that they didn't. and that she would need cochlear implants, which are a very invasive and dangerous surgery. But at least there was a bit of hope. Next, the heart was checked, and they said that she could probably live with the meds for a few years until she grew, and then a small balloon insertion surgery should do the trick to fix her heart. That was encouraging, but the meds she needed were full on. To keep her heart pumping enough, we had to give her 1 drop of a very strong medicine twice a day. Put 1 drop on a spoon and then wipe it on her tongue. If you ever get 2 drops in her mouth by accident, come to the ER immediately, because that could completely overwhelm her entire system. Continuous tension. The fattening up happened by putting a feeding tube in Samara's nose so that we could just push the milk down her throat. In Kenya, they had managed to get her off the tube and drinking from a tiny cup. That had been such an important step to independent eating, and now it was taken away again. We had to force feed her, and it was very uncomfortable. Samara didn't like the tube, and with her tiny fingers managed to pull it out of her nose many, many times. She was extremely strong and determined, even at that size. So, Daniel and I had to learn how to insert these tubes so that we didn't have to go to hospital all the time. It was a terrible trauma to push them up her nose, all the way down into her stomach, and make sure they sat at the right spot. And all that time, Samara was screaming her little lungs out. It was horrible. On top of that, she couldn't keep her food down. Samara threw up most of what we fed her. The milk would come up her mouth and her nose, and she wouldn't be able to breathe for a while until we got her nose cleared out. She always went into a state of panic, overarching her entire body in an attempt to breathe, and it took quite a while to calm her down again. This happened many times a day, so we had to be constantly by her side to make sure that she didn't choke. It also meant we didn't sleep, because she didn't sleep for long periods of time because of her tummy issues and her feeding schedule. The first 6 months of her life, we took turns sleeping in 3-hour cycles. One of us would go to bed, the other would carry Samara around, trying to keep her calm and trying to feed her 1 milliliter of milk every 5 minutes. And after 3 hours of that, Daniel would wake me up and I would take my turn, walking her around so that he could sleep. And that's how we spent all of our nights. One evening, the choking of her milk got so bad that she completely stopped breathing for so long that she went completely white. We called the ambulance, and thankfully she caught her breath again, but only after we had cleared her airways with a suction tool. We were admitted to hospital, and the next morning, the same thing happened again in hospital. The nurse pushed the emergency button, and a whole group of doctors and nurses came running to her bed, getting suction machines, making sure there was still a pulse, and thankfully, she survived. But we were immediately moved to the ICU, where Samara had closer care and constant supervision. Those days in ICU were my first real low point. I had so many questions why God was allowing all this suffering in my little girl's life that had just begun. But we had to stay strong for her sake. We had to keep taking care of her, and so we kept going. One thing that really helped me in that season was a sentence that friends had given us as an encouragement before we left Kenya. Our very good friends came the evening before we left to say goodbye and told us about the sermon they'd heard, which was about times when we don't understand God's actions. And this sentence has stuck with me ever since. When you can't see God's hand, trust His heart. This was certainly a situation where I could not see God's hand. Where was He? Why wasn't He taking better care of my child? But I knew God's heart. I knew that He loves us and wants the best for us. So we kept trusting and we kept praying. I'm going to give you a minute or two to think about a time in your life where God was silent, where you had lots of questions and you couldn't see what He's doing. And what does it mean to trust His heart? What do we know about God's heart? Once she was stabilized on the ICU, the eye surgery was planned, and her cataracts were removed. This is the first picture we have of Samara looking through eyes that can see. The gray from her eye was gone, but she couldn't actually see that much yet. First, her eyes needed to heal from the pain, and she needed contact lenses because she didn't have her own lenses anymore. Those needed to be fitted and manufactured, which we then had to put into her eyes every morning and take out every evening. That sounds simple, but it really wasn't. The contacts would move and get stuck under her eyelid. Then we'd have to try to find them and get them out with a suction tool. Or they would get loose and fall out. So we'd have to search the floor for a tiny little round see-through piece of glass. We lost many, many contacts over the years, and we spent hours searching for them. We were told that with the eye surgery comes the chance of secondary glaucoma. It's a state of the eye where it can't regulate its own fluids, and it builds pressure inside of the eye. If the pressure gets too high, you can get blind from it. We prayed really hard that Samara would not get that glaucoma. But at our first checkup after her eye surgery, we found out that she did have it. It is a condition that can never be fixed. It can only be regulated by giving eye drops twice daily. But even with those drops, the pressure can still change at random, which then requires surgical intervention to relieve the pressure. And even then, the surgery only works sometimes. So with the discovery of her glaucoma, we knew this would be a lifelong battle. And it was. Over her lifetime, she had 6 surgeries just for her eye pressure, countless painful eye checkups, and several different medications she needed on a daily basis. But that wasn't the bottom of the roller coaster yet. Before we even got to leave the hospital after the eye surgery, the doctors discovered that Samara's heart was a lot weaker than they first expected, and that she wouldn't be able to wait a few years until the surgery. Bad news. But the good news was that she only needed a balloon dilation surgery, which was much easier than an open heart surgery. It's a much smaller incision where they put in a little deflated balloon through the veins, and then it gets blown up by the valve that is too tight, and it breaks the tissue so that it opens up and the blood can move back and forth freely. And that should fix it. When the balloon deflates, the valve is open, and all should be good. This could be repeated if necessary as she grew older and would not create a big issue. They did tell us, though, that this method works for 95% of people who get the operation done. Only 5% have flexible tissue, which doesn't expand when the balloon collapses again. And the balloon is removed, then it just tightens up again. So we'd have to just give it a try and hope that it works. But the odds were on our side. 5% is a very small percentage, right? Well, guess what? Samara was in the 5%. The dilation did not work, and we were faced with full-on open heart surgery to insert an artificial valve, which would then have to be repeated every few years because the valve would have to be renewed as she grew. We were horrified. This was my second low point of the journey. Why would God do that? Why was He not answering any of our prayers? So many people all around the world were praying for us. I was sending out regular emails with updates and prayer requests, and this one had been a huge prayer request. A small surgery that would have made our lives so much easier had failed and left us with this daunting future of open heart surgery staring at us for the rest of Samara's life. He could have made the dilation thing work. Why didn't He? An open heart surgery is life-threatening to anyone, but Samara was still tiny. She had only gained a few 100 grams since we arrived in Germany. Her heart was completely exhausted from the last 2 surgeries, and no one even dared to operate on her anymore. So the doctors wisely suggested we take a break, focus on stabilizing Samara, feeding her, and hoping that she grows to 3 kilos by the time she's 6 months, so we could do the open heart surgery then. At this point, Daniel and I were completely finished. Samara was only 4 months old, but things had gone from bad to worse to even worse. We hardly ever slept. We got constant bad news from the doctors. We had to continually watch our daughter be in pain and daily cause her pain ourselves. And there seemed to be no end to this pattern of life in our future. We didn't know if we could ever go back to Kenya, if we would ever continue our work here as missionaries, or if we had to abandon our supposed calling to take care of Samara. We didn't know if we'd ever be able to communicate with our daughter through speech, or even hear her say our name. The doctors gave no prognosis. None of them had ever seen a case like hers in their entire careers. We were left just feeling exhausted and lost, in a place we don't call home, where neither of us had any parents to come and help. And I remember one conversation that Daniel and I had very vividly. We were sitting in a hospital room, and Samara was sleeping for a change. I asked him, Daniel, you know how people always say, when you're at your lowest point, you feel the closest to God. And you're really down and out, God comes close. Do you feel closer to God right now? And he answered, no, I don't feel close at all. I feel like he's very far away. Yeah, me too. And we started being very honest with each other and with God about how we felt. For a long time, when people asked me if this journey with Samara brought me closer to God, I said, no, I don't feel like it's brought me closer. But it has made my relationship with him more authentic. I don't use Christian platitudes anymore. I'm very aware of what I say to him or about him. For quite a while, Daniel and I didn't pray much anymore. We would thank him for what we found to thank, and we would ask for strength to handle what came our way. But we didn't ask for specific prayer requests anymore. It was too painful. We had been receiving so many no's from God that I told him, you just do what you see fit, because that's what you're going to do anyway. There's no point in asking. We also had no strength left for any quiet time or Bible reading. Almost an entire year, neither Daniel or I read our Bibles regularly. We'd pull it out from time to time, but whatever we read felt irrelevant to our lives. We were exhausted and emotionally spent. But we did read something. We had received a children's Bible from some dear friends, which was meant for Samara. But Daniel and I read it together almost every day. It was something that we could digest at this season of our lives. There's something beautiful about children's Bibles. They convey very deep truths in a very simple language. And this Bible reminded us of God's love, of his sovereignty, and of his power in simple stories, which was a huge blessing to us. So one of my suggestions for anyone dealing with severe pain and loss is to be authentic. Be honest with God about how you feel. You're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to have doubts. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be exhausted and not do your normal spiritual routine. God can handle it. But keep your eyes open for ways in which God shows you his presence, like he did for us with the children's Bible. Take a moment to ask yourself, am I honest with God? Or do I say to him what I think I'm supposed to say? Another way we saw God's presence was through his family. At that low point where we felt completely overwhelmed, we didn't even know where we would live those next 2 to 3 months until the surgery. Some friends from a church in Germany stepped up. One friend wrote to me and said, I just read your updates, and this is just unbelievable. This is too much for you guys. You can't handle this alone. We're going to help you. And they did. The whole church got on board, and they made a rota for when people would come and bring us meals, when someone would come and babysit Samara so that we could sleep. Those were trained nurses so that they could handle Samara's medication. And when some of them would come and visit to just spend time with us so that we had other things to talk about. My brother and sister-in-law found us 6 places to house it. So every few weeks, we'd move to another empty house and live there for a while, receiving meals, help, and care from people we hardly knew, but who were part of our church community. It was amazing to see how these people became the hands and feet of God and showed us God's love in a very tangible way. We experienced the same thing here again at One Tribe a few years later, when the whole church rallied together and helped us on so many different levels, many to whom we had no deep connection, but they lived out God's love. Through these experiences, church community and the wider family of Christ has become so important to me. I understand why God placed us in communities, not just to be nice to each other, but to be God's love to one another. I think sometimes our hearts are so heavy and our spirits are so low that we struggle to hear or feel God. And we actually need some human touch. We need some human care to feel noticed and loved. And God knows that. He knows we're human, and we need physical evidences of love as well as his spiritual ones. So he uses us as the church, as his family, to be his love to one another. Let's remember that when we go out and meet friends. Maybe our touch is a sign of God's love to them. So let's be generous with it. To continue our story, Samara did reach 3 kilos before she turned 6 months, and she was able to have the open heart surgery as scheduled. It is not possible to describe the feeling of helplessness and the fear of loss as you wheel your child into theater, not knowing if she'll come back to you. But there's also no way to describe the relief and gratitude when the doctor calls and says everything went well. The surgery did go well, and Samara recovered from it extremely fast. She was such a fighter and always recovered from her surgeries much faster than people expected. Samara was with us for almost 8 years, so I can't continue telling her story at the rate I've been doing so far. Things weren't always quite as dramatic as those first 7 months. We had quiet and more peaceful times as a family, which grew to 3 kids. But we had many, many difficult phases that were very scary, very challenging, and spent many more weeks in hospital. All in all, Samara had 15 surgeries, and I traveled to Germany with her every 6 to 12 months for endless checkups. In her 8 years, Samara never ate by herself. She was always fed through her tube. She never learned to speak, but she could hear quite a lot once she had 2 cochlear implants put into her ears. She also never learned to walk on her own, but she did become a lot more mobile once she got a little yellow walker that she was very proud of at 4 years. She went through a lot of pain and also frustration because she wasn't able to communicate in a way that she wanted to. She didn't have an easy life. But Samara was a beautiful and extremely joyful and content little girl. And she was such a huge joy and blessing to us. She made us laugh, and she made us see life in the here and now. When she wasn't in pain or being poked and pricked by medical staff, she was amazingly content. This picture is after her second open heart surgery, and she was just all smiles. She would play with whatever she could feel lying around her, touching different textures, exploring her surroundings, making loud noises that she could hear with her hearing aids, and then giggling to herself. If she couldn't find any objects around to play, she would just clap her hands or make clicking noises with her tongue to entertain herself. But her favorite thing was playing with light. She started when she was very small, that she could focus on light, and she just continued doing that all her life. She never got to see like we do, but she did see lights and colors very well. And she loved squinting her eyes and looking into different lights. She would place her hand in front of her face like this, and then she'd wave her hand back and forth in front of her eyes because it makes the light come and go in different intensities. And she absolutely loved that. Here you can see her doing that. She would lie for an hour just playing with light and giggling about the dancing beauty that she created. The other thing that always made her happy was swinging. Everyone who's heard me talk about Samara has heard me talk about her swing. She could be on a swing for hours, just swaying back and forth, leaning into the wind, doing some crazy stunts. The higher, the better. She would laugh out loud in joy and delight, and she never wanted to stop. It was a place she felt free from her limitations and just had fun. I'm sharing these things for two reasons. One, so you can get to know her a little bit and see her beauty and her laughter. But also because I find it important to remember that despite the loss and pain we feel, it is good to see the blessings and the joy we still receive. And I realized during my preparation that my journey of loss has many such coexistences or dualities, things that seem to be opposites, but actually they go together. And I want to share 4 of those with you this morning. That's a big one. Pain and God's goodness. How did we deal with the constant pain and suffering we saw so close up? We had a lot of phases where we found strength in the promises of God to see us through, and where we felt His strength giving us the courage to keep going, knowing that He is in control and that He does want the best for us. I remember one time when I was in ICU, where she had just had another surgery and was in a lot of pain, recovering from it. I had a conversation with the dad of the child lying next to Samara. He was overwhelmed by the cruelty of why little children have to suffer like this. And when I told him how God was giving us strength, he just gave me a sarcastic smile and said, I don't know how you can believe in God when you have a child like this, going through so much pain for so many years. If there was a God, He wouldn't allow this. And I gently responded that I had known God long before I had my child, and that I have a history and a relationship with Him, which gives me faith in His existence and in His goodness, despite the suffering that's going on right now. And I think that is a very important truth to hold on to in our pain and loss. We don't have the big picture perspective. And the truths that we know about God in our easy times are still true in our hard times. So when I have doubts, and they still come, it really helps me to go back to the basics of what I know. Think about the truths that I know deep in my heart to be true. 1, God is still the creator of everything. 2, God didn't just make us and leave us to our own fate. He cares about each one of us. 3, He showed His care and love through His Son Jesus, taking all the pain and sins of the world on Himself, and beating death and rising from the dead, and that shows that He is in control. 4, when I look at the life of Jesus and how He treated people, I know He cares, even when I don't understand what He's doing. 5, I know that God wants me to be with Him forever in His perfect kingdom, where there will be no more pain and no more sorrow. He has made me His child and will welcome me in His arms when I leave this world, and it will make all the hardships of this earth pale. 6, I know God doesn't owe me anything. He is a just God, and He never promised us an easy life. But He promises to walk with us and give us strength to stand up under the weight of the world. This last point helped us to never ask the question, why me? A lot of people would come and ask us that, but Daniel and I both just answered, why not us? There is nothing special about us. Bad things happen to everyone, so why not us? I think that is a very healthy perspective to have, and not to live with these in all the things that He suffered and all the questions He had, which God didn't really answer. He said, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Something very important I've understood over the last years is that God does not have to prove his goodness to us. God is good all the time. And all the time? Really? Can we say that? Even when we can't feel any goodness in our lives? How? Because God's goodness is his character. That's who he is. He doesn't have to show us his goodness through good things. He often does bless us with good things, and we are thankful for them. But the things are not what we should be holding on to. It is God. He has shown his goodness to us by making a way for us to be with him. I, in my sinfulness and my imperfection, can never try hard enough to be good enough to be with him, to be with a perfect God. But in his love for us, he made a way for us to have fellowship now and for our souls to be together with him in eternity. By sending his son, which caused him excruciating pain, and allowing him to die on the cross to pay for my sin, I now have access to God, to fellowship with him. Because he raised Jesus from the dead, we know that he is the victor over death and that we will be with him forever, even after this life on earth. This in itself is the goodness of God. Jesus said, "In this world you will have trouble." He didn't deny it. But take heart, I have overcome the world. He didn't promise us an easy life, but he did promise us to be there. One of my favorite verses that God gave me in a time of great exhaustion is this: "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And that's on your little leaflets that you got this morning, or bookmarks, to remember. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. He promised to be with us in his goodness, and that alone will give rest to our souls, even in the hardships. And to be able to have some time to just reflect on that, I'd love us to listen to a song together. It's called "The Goodness of Jesus." Come, you weary heart, now to Jesus. Come, you anxious soul, now and see. There is perfect love and comfort in your tears. Rest here in his wondrous peace. Oh, the goodness of Jesus. Satisfied, he is all that I need. May it become what may, that I'll rest all my days in the goodness of Jesus. May it become what may, that I'll rest all my days in the goodness of Jesus. Sing along with me. Come and find your hope now in Jesus. He is all he said he would be. Grace is overflowing from the Savior's heart. Rest here in his wondrous peace. Oh, the goodness of Jesus. Satisfied, he is all that I need. May it become what may, that I'll rest all my days in the goodness of Jesus. May it become what may, that I'll rest all my days in the goodness of Jesus. Heavenly Father, that is our prayer. We pray that we may again and again come to that point of just seeing your goodness in Jesus and what you did for us, that you love us enough to give your life and to conquer death, Lord, for each of us who have lost a loved one. This truth that you are the victor over death brings so much hope and so much joy. But we thank you that you didn't just do it so we would see each other again, but that we can be with you in your fullness. Thank you for your goodness, Lord. Amen. Another coexistence that is hard to put together: faith and fear. The other hard thing to handle was fear. Loss also creates fear, the fear of more loss. I was constantly thinking, what if something else bad happens? What if Samara loses all of her sight and she can't enjoy playing with lights anymore? What if her heart loses more strength? What if she never learns to speak and I never get to hear her inside person? What if she never grows up to be an adult? Some losses are so painful that the thought of more loss is almost unbearable and you become fearful. I had a lot of fear to deal with. And then you have well-meaning Christians come up and tell you, just trust God. If you have enough faith, your fear will go away. Have you heard that before? Have you had well-meaning people come with well-meaning statements that don't help? I did trust God. I trusted him to be there and to help me through whatever valley was coming. But I did not trust him to make my life easy or to not allow more hardship. That's not what he promises. And although I know that God will see me through, the pain of the hardship still makes me fearful. And thankfully, we had one counselor who very intentionally told us, no, what those people have told you is not true. Faith and fear can coexist. You don't have to feel guilty for not having enough faith just because you have fear. Faith and fear can coexist. You have every reason to feel fear. Many things you feared have happened in your life, and the things you worried about are real and could happen. But God can help you handle your fear. Is this something you've asked yourselves before? What do I do with the fear that just keeps nagging, that I can't just talk away? What I learned over the years is that there are almost like different levels in my soul. On the top level, I have a strong faith in God's goodness and his care for me. Under that, though, there is often the sense of fear of more pain in certain situations, because I know that God doesn't protect us from all harm and pain, and I'm scared to go through it. But then there is an even deeper level, which is my foundation. And under the fear, there is the certainty that God will never leave me and will carry me through, and will ultimately take me home to be with him. So the answer to my question is this third level and the foundation of my soul. As long as that belief deep down is stronger and deeper than the fear I have, then I can manage the fear and trust God with it. There is a verse in the Bible that says, perfect love casts out fear. It's love, not faith. And I've reflected on that for many years now. I haven't read up any theologians' clever words on it, but I figure when we experience that perfect love of God in all its fullness, all fear will be gone. And sadly, I think that we won't experience his love in its entire fullness here on earth. There are too many distractions and evil influences around us. But when we get to heaven, his perfect love will fully encompass us, and all fear will be gone. And every once in a while, I think we get a glimpse of that fullness of his perfect love, and we truly lose our fear for that moment. I have experienced that, and I hope you do too. But please, if you are in a place of fearing loss, don't let anyone make you feel guilty about it. I still have those fears come back. Then I talk to God about it, and I ask Him to show me the deeper level of trust, of faith, and hope that He puts into our spirits, and which holds us together because it's a strong foundation which our fears can't break. Take 2 or 3 minutes to maybe share a fear, or to just pray with each other to find that deeper foundation and this real deep trust in Him. Joy and sorrow, another coexistence. Don't wait for the joy to come after the sorrow. It is there within it. I remember one day coming back from the hospital and feeling completely emotionally exhausted. Not just about now, but about the prospect of a future we would continually have to deal with these threats to Samara's life. The surgeries and the uncertainty of always being just one step away from a medical emergency. We came back to our little apartment that friends had graciously offered us, feeling completely deflated and almost tired of life. That was one of the only times that I felt that deep despair in my heart of not having energy for this kind of life. And as we walked inside, my family was sitting inside. My parents and siblings had come. They had made tea and brought yummy pastries from a bakery close by. They gave us all hugs and were in merry spirits. We chatted and laughed and had a good time. And at that moment, I felt God's Spirit say to me, there will also be good times. Yes, I know life is hard right now. And yes, it won't get easy anytime soon. But that is not all of your life. It's not all encompassing. I will also give you joy and laughter and people to show you love and bring you sweets. I think that is also very important truth to hold on to. Our loss may feel all-consuming at times, but it's not our entire life. It is only one part of what is going on in our lives. There are also lots of good things to see. The fourth one, God's voice and His silence. Another time I got a very clear encouragement from God was through a song. I was driving a borrowed car in Germany from my sister's house to the hospital, with Samara sitting in the back, clicking away, enjoying herself, oblivious to the fact that she was going to have a big surgery the next day. I was overtired since I was in Germany with my 2 girls alone. Daniel and Joshua had stayed in Kenya, and it was raining heavily and already dark. So I put on some loud music to keep me awake and focused as I drove carefully through the night and rain. I had put a song on YouTube, and it just kept finding its own new songs, as it does. And there were songs I didn't know. But suddenly, I heard some lyrics that got my attention. Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall. And I just thought, yes, exactly. Samara was 7 years old, and we were still fighting the same stupid eye pressure issues that just never seemed to go away and always threatened to take her eyesight completely. And then the next line of the song is, but you have never failed me yet. My tears just started flowing freely. It continues, waiting for change to come. I know the battle's won. You have never failed me yet. Really? Had He never failed me? I could count many times that God has disappointed my expectations. Isn't that the same thing as failing me? I don't think so. In all the struggles and pain, He has held us up. He has kept us going. He has not let us fall or left us on our own. I know that to be true. But at the same time, it did sometimes feel like God had failed us. And in midst of the pain and loss, it sometimes is hard to keep the big picture alive. So this song brought many tears to my eyes because it felt like God was sending it to me specifically to build my faith. The chorus says, "Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness. I am still in your hands. This is my confidence. You have never failed me yet." Yes, I was confident that I was in his hands, no matter what happened. And I sang along loudly in my car where it says, "You made a way where there was no way, and I believe that you can do it again." God sent me this song at this time because he knew exactly what I needed to hear. He knew what doubts and questions were going on in my heart, and the words of this song brought the healing and the encouragement my soul needed. This wasn't always the case, though. I had other times where I called out to God in immense sadness and desperation, and I felt nothing. I heard nothing. God seemed to be completely silent. I don't know why he does that. I have a lot of questions that are still unanswered, and I don't think I will get answers in this lifetime. There are times when God just seems silent. But there are also those times where he speaks, where he comforts, and shows us that he is there, that he cares. And I needed to learn to live in that imbalance of God's responses and to cherish those signs of his grace so that I learned to trust his sovereignty and trust his heart, even in the times that I can't see his hand. Which coexistences do you see in your life? These are just 4 that I experienced a lot. There might be completely different ones in yours. But just because things seem like they don't go together, it's not always the truth. There are a lot of things that God brings into our lives at the same time. I called this talk Worship in Every Season, because I think my loss has had a big impact on my worship of God. A long time ago, I was amazed to learn when the word worship is first used in the Bible. Does anyone know? Where is the first time, the first story in the Bible that the word worship is actually used? We're 100 people. Be brave. Who knows? Yes, somebody got it. Abraham. Yay, joy. Well done. So, it's when Abraham is being asked by God to sacrifice his son, Isaac, and go up the hill. Abraham doesn't understand why God would ask him to kill his own son as a sacrifice. But he goes out in obedience, and he says to his servants, "Stay here while my son and I go to worship on the hill." That is the first scenario where this word comes from. It is not a feel-good song. It is a sacrifice to God. And not just any sacrifice, but giving up your most precious thing in order to tell God, "I love you and I trust you." For those of you who come to One Tribe, you'll remember the sermon a few weeks ago that this is the same story where God was given the name Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Because in the end, Abraham does not have to sacrifice his son. God provided a lamb to be killed instead. And so Abraham gave God the name, "In my deepest need, God sees me and provides." I'm sure that moment on the mountain where Abraham had to tie up his son and make him the offering to God was a time where he did not understand God's hand. But why did he still follow him in obedience? Because he trusted God's heart. He knew God's love, God's care, and God's power, and he knew that God was trustworthy. When Samara got sick in the beginning of 2018, I also knew that God was trustworthy. We got more and more worried as her fevers didn't go away, over 8 weeks. But as I sat by her bed in the ER on March 3rd, I wasn't ready to say goodbye. Samara had always fought all her sicknesses. She would fight this one too. I remember telling God, "It's too early for you to take her." But it was God's time, and He's the only one who understands why. Daniel's first sentence to the nurses was, "We've been preparing ourselves for this the last 8 years. We know where she's gone to." And my first message to friends and family was, "She's singing in heaven, waiting for us." We didn't understand why God didn't send us a lamb to provide in this terrible situation, but we knew that He was trustworthy. We chose to worship, saying to God, "I love you and I trust you," even after giving up our most precious gift in this world. It wasn't a feel-good song. It was a painful sacrifice. After Samara was gone, the feeling of loss, pain, and sadness hit a new level. A lot of the old feelings came back, but much more intense. I lost my sense of identity. Since the last 8 years, I had been Mama Samara. I had spent most of my days taking her to many different therapies all around Nairobi, and had spent most of my energy taking care of Samara and our other 2 kids. Who was I now? What would I do? Intense fear came back. I had terrible anxiety that my other 2 kids would also get sick and die. God didn't keep Samara alive, so how do I know He won't take the others away from me too? My personality changed. I wasn't the happy, outgoing, optimistic lady who bravely faces challenges. I was sad. I was crying a lot, and I liked to be on my own. I didn't recognize myself. But when I mentioned to one of my close friends that I feel like a completely different person who's always sad, she looked at me with so much love and said, "Damaris, it won't always be like that." I couldn't imagine how that would ever change. But she was right. And I can't tell you how or when it changed, but it was a slow and gradual change. And I can only credit it to God's amazing ways of touching our souls and working in our lives. God provided for us in the deepest valley of my life. I don't want to make big statements on grief and healing, but I do want to share a few things that really helped me in my journey, and I hope that it will be helpful to some of you who are here. In a book I received, grief and loss was described as this darkness that overwhelms us. It is uncomfortable, and we naturally want to run away from it, trying to ignore the darkness. But as we try to leave the darkness behind us, it just keeps following us, and we'll never be fast enough to outrun it. And so we feel its darkness is hanging over us. But if we face the darkness and walk into the night, as we keep walking, we will find the sunrise. This picture really spoke to me and helped me to make very intentional choices to sit in my darkness. I would take many hours in my week to consciously think about Samara, to ask God questions, to journal about memories and regrets. I made many photo collages and processed the beauty of her life through those photos. I went to counseling and discussed a lot of my thoughts and questions there. I cried a lot and allowed the sadness to come. I walked into the darkness, and it was hard and tiring. But in all of that, a friend sent me the verse from Micah 7, verse 8. "Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light." And that was so true for me. I knew I wasn't alone in this darkness, and God kept showing me His light. After Samara's death, I never had that feeling again of God being very far away. He was always close, always comforting and approachable. I felt His love covering and holding me, even when it was painful. One thing God used to bring healing into my heart was worship through music. Songs all through Samara's life encouraged us and kept us trusting Him. After Samara's death, during my intense grieving, I said no to everything that I was asked to do, except when I was asked by Munisi to lead the worship team at church. Somehow, I felt God tell me that this job was okay, that He would use worship as part of my healing journey. And He has. Preparing and singing songs so regularly of praise to God reminded me of who He is. One of my favorite definitions of worship is this: in my times of worship, I sing back to God what I have learned and understood about Him, and I thank Him for that. So spending all this time leading the church in worship filled me with gratitude and awe for who God is. When I talk of healing and comfort, I'm not talking about the pain being gone or my heart being whole again. I don't think that will ever happen. Losing a child is not something that just becomes normal and the pain completely disappears. The saying, time heals all wounds, is not true. I don't know who came up with that, but time does not just make it better. It's painful, and there is a hole in my heart that will never be filled by anyone or anything else in this lifetime. But I was given a beautiful quote after Samara's funeral that has proven to be true for me and many people who have experienced the loss of a loved one. It is a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It is wrong to say that God fills the gap that a lost one leaves. He does not fill it at all, but rather He keeps it unfilled and thereby helps us preserve our true fellowship, even in pain. The more beautiful and fuller the memories, the harder the separation. But gratitude transforms the agony of memories into a quiet joy. 2 books that I would recommend to anyone who has lost a loved one are these 2. The 1 Year Book of Hope. It is a small portion, 1 page, half a page of encouragement for each day of the year. I read it in 3 years. Shows you how slowly I read it. But those 3 years, I loved my times with this book and hearing from God through it. So if you want to find a gift for somebody who's going through grief, that's a great one. And the other one is by Jeremy Sitzer, A Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss. Jeremy talks about how sorrow and loss can enlarge our souls and give us a greater capacity to love. And it's my prayer that God would do that in my life. My closing thought, as I come to an end. I want to leave you with a thought this morning that is something very new in my head, that I only started reflecting on a few weeks ago. I read Psalm 32, verse 7, and noticed the words, "You surround me with songs of deliverance." I know that phrase from a very familiar song. You've probably heard it, "No longer slave to fear." But as I read it this time, I was wondering why it doesn't just read, "You deliver me." That would be easier to say and would also be accurate to God's promise. Why did the author choose to speak of songs of deliverance and of being surrounded? Music is definitely a gift of God to all of us. Music can lift our spirits, can give us energy when we're in a gym and need some music pumping. It can remind us of special memories. It can touch our hearts in a way that sometimes makes us sad and sometimes builds us up. It touches a deep part inside of us that little else can touch in that way. And when we add lyrics to music, it becomes even more powerful. Sometimes the music in itself is very powerful. But I wonder if the author used the term songs of deliverance to signify the encouragement God wants to give us when the actual deliverance has not yet come. When we are still in a dark and struggling place where we're yearning for deliverance. God promises to surround us with his encouragement and uplift our souls with his touch, like songs that let us know deliverance is on the way. I am coming. Just hold on. The victory has been won, and your deliverance is sure. I find that a lot of our Christian walk is about waiting. We wait to become more like him. We wait for strongholds to be broken. We wait for prayers to be answered. We wait to see his kingdom coming. And we wait to his promises to be fulfilled. And ultimately, we're waiting to one day be with him fully in his presence when we leave this earth. But it's not a passive wait. It's not like waiting for a bus to arrive and pick us up. We wait in expectancy, in activity of getting to know him more, experiencing him every day, learning more about who he is and what he's doing, so we can join him in all he does in this world. But as we join in bringing his kingdom, we're also waiting. One of my favorite verses is from Psalm 27. I am still confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and courageous. Take heart and wait for the Lord. I don't know what losses you have experienced in your life, and I don't know where you are at in your journey of healing. But remember, God is there, and he is walking this journey with you. The pain may never completely go away, but God is bringing healing in his way and in his time. May we all wait for the Lord, knowing that we will see his goodness and hear his songs of deliverance surrounding us, reassuring us that he has already won the victory and his deliverance is coming. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Thanks for coming.